Tonight, I want to start with a single image that still feels almost unreal. One of the largest urban cultures of the ancient world left us carefully planned cities, standardized weights, long-distance trade, and a writing system we still can't confidently read more than 4,000 years later. That quiet fact is the doorway into our whole theme. Because this isn't just about one civilization. It's about the strange places where the record thins out, and the story gets harder to follow. The shadows between chapters. The moments where we can see the ruins, we can touch the artifacts. Sometimes we can even trace the roads and the water systems. But when we reach for the voices themselves, the voices aren't there anymore. Now, if you're using this video to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it's fascinating seeing London at breakfast and San Francisco at bedtime. All at once, all of us wondering about the same mysteries. Here's what makes these gaps so compelling. We have physical evidence that these civilizations existed. We can walk through their streets, measure their walls, study their tools and their art. But then, in some places, the trail suddenly goes quiet. It's like picking up a book that's missing a few crucial chapters right in the middle, and having to reconstruct the plot from hints left in the margins. Human history has gaps not because people stopped living, but because a lot of what they did didn't survive long enough for us to see it. The record is uneven. Sometimes it's loud and detailed, and sometimes it goes quiet. And when it goes quiet, our brains want to jump in and supply a neat explanation. But usually, it's messier than that. A gap doesn't automatically mean a giant mystery with one dramatic cause. It can be pretty ordinary. Materials decay, wood rots, cloth disappears, ink fades. A flood rearranges a whole neighborhood. A fire wipes out an archive. Later builders reuse stone because it's practical, not because they're trying to erase anyone. And sometimes the quiet is just a side effect of how a society worked. Not every culture relied on long-term writing in the way we're used to. Some kept memory in stories, work, training, ritual, and community practice. That kind of knowledge can be rich and precise, but it doesn't always leave something that lasts in the ground. Then there are the more painful gaps, the ones tied to power. Conquest, forced migration, political cleansing, the kind of thing that doesn't just break buildings but can break continuity of identity. Names change. Languages get pushed aside. Old stories get overwritten. That silence isn't accidental. And yes, there are also the gaps that follow collapse. The version of the story we often get is simple. A civilization falls and everything goes dark. But that's not usually how it feels on the ground. A big state can fragment. People can move into smaller communities. Trade can shrink. Writing might become rare because the institutions that trained scribes and paid them are gone. But daily life keeps going. People still plant crops, raise kids, argue with neighbors, worship, rebuild. So when we say lost epoch, we're not claiming a hidden super civilization or some fantasy chapter of history. We're talking about the normal limits of evidence, and the very real disruptions that sometimes make those limits sharper. Over the next chapters, we'll take this idea into places where the record gets thin in different ways. The Bronze Age collapse, with its chain reaction of crises across an interconnected world. The long reshaping of Europe after Roman authority faded in the West. The Indus Valley, where cities were carefully planned, but an undeciphered script still keeps many intimate details out of reach. The Americas before European contact, where some societies declined, others transformed, and older narratives too often flattened the story into something simpler than it was. African civilizations, whose histories were long undertold despite strong archaeological and textual traces. The Pacific, where navigation was a disciplined art, not luck, and certainly not guesswork, and further back still, the Younger Dryas, a reminder that climate can change the rules for human settlement in surprisingly abrupt ways. The point isn't to force one explanation onto everything. The point is to move slowly through these quiet sections of the record and notice what the silence can and can't tell us. And maybe, as you listen, it becomes easier to accept a gentle truth. Some parts of the past are clear, some are blurry, and some are going to stay incomplete. That's not a failure. It's just what time does. When we say that history has gaps, it's easy to imagine a dramatic cause right away, like an invasion, a fire, or a sudden apocalypse. But most of the time, the truth is less cinematic and more human. The past is uneven because evidence is uneven. Some places wrote a lot and built in stone. Others built with wood and mud brick and told their stories out loud. Some regions were excavated early and thoroughly. Others are still waiting under modern cities, farmland, or forests. And even when a culture did leave writing, we may not be able to read it anymore, or only a tiny fraction survives. So before we get into the big collapses and famous mysteries, it helps to look at the basic mechanics of loss, not because it's dry, but because it's oddly comforting. It means the silence is not always a disaster. Sometimes it's just time doing what time does. Start with materials. A clay tablet can last thousands of years. A parchment manuscript can be eaten by damp and mold. A wooden record-keeping board can vanish without a trace. A city that built mostly in stone gives archaeologists a different kind of future than a city that built mostly in organic materials. Even simple things like the soil chemistry can decide whether bones and textiles survive or dissolve. If you want a plain way to say it, history depends on accidents. The accident of preservation, the accident of discovery, the accident of someone recording the right thing in the first place. That's not a romantic idea, but it's true. Now add the social layer. Not every society cared about preserving an official chronicle for posterity. Many cultures preserved authority and identity through performance. Genealogy recited at ceremonies, laws spoken out loud, skills taught face-to-face. That kind of knowledge can be incredibly precise, but it doesn't always leave us an archive. We sometimes treat writing as the default marker of complexity, but that's more about our habits than theirs. A society can be sophisticated in astronomy, agriculture, navigation, or governance, and still leave relatively few inscriptions. So sometimes what looks like a gap is partly a mismatch between their methods of memory and our methods of recovery. Then there's power. This is where gaps stop being neutral. When empires expand or new dynasties take control, they don't just change taxes and borders. They often change the story a society tells about itself. Old monuments can be defaced. Religious centers can be dismantled or repurposed. Languages can be suppressed. The goal isn't always to destroy everything. Sometimes it's to replace the previous identity with a new one. And if that replacement is successful, later historians may have fewer surviving voices from the people who lost. So a gap can be a political scar. It can be deliberate forgetting, not just accidental loss. Still, the kind of gap that most people feel in their gut is the one that follows collapse. So let's slow down and be precise about what collapse even means. It rarely means total disappearance of a population. More often, it means a rapid change in scale and organization. A centralized state loses coherence. A palace system stops functioning. Long-distance trade shrinks. Elite crafts become rarer. Large cities may be partly abandoned, or at least stop building in the styles we associate with high government power. The paper trail or the clay trail thins out because the institutions that trained scribes, paid them, and stored their records are disrupted. That alone can create the illusion of a huge cultural void. But on the ground, people keep moving through the seasons. They adjust. They try new arrangements. They take old tools and use them in simpler ways. They keep the parts of their culture that still fit their new reality. In other words, a collapse can be a break in the kind of complexity that leaves big monuments and consistent archives, not a break in life itself. This is why the phrase "Dark Ages" is tricky. It can be a useful shorthand for periods where our documentation gets thinner, but it can also unfairly imply that nothing important was happening. And something was always happening. New local powers were rising. New trade patterns were forming. New religious practices were spreading. New languages and identities were taking shape. Sometimes these were quiet changes, but quiet doesn't mean uninteresting. It just means harder to catch in the evidence. Another thing worth saying plainly is that collapse often has multiple causes that stack up. We have a habit of hunting for a single villain, a single invading group, a single drought, a single plague. But complex societies fail for complex reasons. A drought might weaken food security. That can increase internal unrest. That unrest can make a state more vulnerable to attacks. The attacks can disrupt trade. The trade disruption can make it harder to equip armies or maintain public works. You end up with a cascade. Each piece of pressure alone might be survivable. Together, they can be decisive. This is one reason historians are cautious about sweeping claims. The evidence tends to show overlapping stresses rather than one clean trigger. Even so, there's a psychological reason these gaps fascinate us. When the trail goes quiet, our minds lean forward. We want to know what it felt like to live in the moment when a familiar world started slipping. We want to know what people did with uncertainty. Did they cling to old rituals? Did they reshape them? Did they move? Did they fight for the old order or quietly build something new? Those are deeply human questions, and they show up in every era. We can't always answer them directly, but we can often see hints in the archaeology. Shifts in settlement patterns, changes in diet, the rise of new fortifications, or the appearance of new styles of art and burial. These are the small fingerprints of adaptation. If you're listening to this as a sleep story, this chapter is really here to set the rules of the road. We are not going to treat every silence as a doorway to wild speculation. We're going to treat it as an invitation to careful imagination that stays anchored to what we can actually support. We will give weight to the simplest explanations first: preservation, materials, and the limits of the record. Then we will consider the larger forces: politics, economics, migration, disease, and climate. And we will keep returning to the idea that a historical gap is not a blank human landscape. It is a gap in our visibility, sometimes big, sometimes small, sometimes temporary. That mindset matters because it changes how we approach the case studies ahead. When we reach the end of the Bronze Age, we'll be looking at an interconnected world that shows signs of multiple pressures hitting at once. When we move into the transformation of the Western Roman world, we'll be looking at a long process that reshaped institutions more than it erased people. When we visit the Indus Valley, we'll be facing a different kind of gap entirely, one where the cities speak clearly through their design and materials, but keep their inner political and religious voices just out of reach. Each chapter will be a different texture of silence. Some will feel like a slammed door, some will feel like a slow fading of a radio signal, and some will feel like a language we can almost understand if we listen hard enough. So with that in mind, we can move into our first major historical rupture. A world of palaces and trade routes around the eastern Mediterranean, so connected that its successes were shared across the region, and so tightly balanced that when the shocks came, the entire system began to wobble. Bronze Age collapse and lost knowledge. If you want a single moment in ancient history that feels like the floor briefly giving way under an entire region, the late Bronze Age collapse is a strong candidate. Around the eastern Mediterranean, roughly in the decades around 1200 BCE, a world that had been wealthy, connected, and surprisingly diplomatic began to fracture. This wasn't a small corner of the map. This was a network of major powers and trade hubs: Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, Egypt's New Kingdom, and the thriving cities of the Levant. Think of it less like isolated kingdoms and more like a system of interlocking gears. Goods moved long distances. Copper and tin became bronze. Grain shipments mattered. Luxury items traveled with the confidence of stable shipping routes. Royal letters crossed borders. Kings addressed each other as equals, negotiated marriages, exchanged gifts, and watched one another's fortunes closely. It could feel, from the inside, like a stable age that knew how to handle threats. And then the confidence faltered. The pattern we see in archaeology is not completely uniform, and that's important. This was not a single dramatic switch turning off across the entire map at exactly the same hour. But across many key sites, the trends look eerily aligned. Destruction layers, abandoned palaces, a drop in long-distance trade, sharp political instability, and in some regions, a temporary shrinking of literacy and centralized administration. The Hittite capital at Hattusa was destroyed and left. Ugarit, a major coastal city, appears to have sent urgent messages for help before being wiped out and not rebuilt. In Mycenaean Greece, the palatial centers that had organized labor, storage, and record-keeping either fell or drastically changed. Egypt held on, but not without a struggle, facing attacks from groups the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples and dealing with its own internal pressures. The more you read the scholarship, the less likely you are to accept a single cause explanation. The old narrative of mysterious invaders appear, everything collapses, is too clean. The Sea Peoples were part of the story, yes, but probably not the whole story. A more realistic picture is a convergence of stresses. Evidence from different disciplines suggests that climate instability and drought may have strained food systems in parts of the region. Earthquakes likely played a role in some cities. Internal rebellions and succession crises may have weakened governments. And once the trade routes that supplied palaces and armies were disrupted, the whole system could start to unravel quickly. This is the part that feels modern in a quiet, unsettling way. Interdependence makes prosperity possible, but it can also make cascading failure more likely when multiple shocks arrive close together. Another angle is the economics of bronze itself. Bronze production relied on copper and tin often had to come from far away. If the long-distance trading system faltered, bronze became harder to produce at scale. That doesn't mean people immediately invented iron as a replacement in one heroic leap. Iron was known earlier, but when bronze became harder to source consistently, iron's value and spread likely increased. So when you see the shift toward iron in the early first millennium BCE, it may reflect adaptation to supply and political reality as much as a simple technological upgrade. People didn't just wake up one day and decide a new age had begun. They adjusted because the old system was failing them. What might have felt like the collapse of a world to the court elites could have felt like a painful, confusing transition for everyone else. The scribes, the administrators, the specialized palace craftsmen, the people whose lives depended on large institutions and predictable patronage, were especially vulnerable. Their training was narrow and deep. Their work was structurally tied to palatial economies. If the palace was gone, the job was gone. And with them, certain kinds of knowledge and cultural habits could become rarer. It's not that intelligence vanished. It's that the scaffolding that supported complex bureaucracy and large-scale record-keeping became unstable. This is where the lost knowledge idea becomes real in a modest, historically responsible way. We're not talking about lost superscience. We're talking about how quickly specialized administrative and cultural systems can shrink when the institutions behind them break. In Greece, one of the clearest signs of reduced visibility is the disappearance of linear B writing after the fall of Mycenaean palace centers. For a time, writing in that region becomes archaeologically scarce. Later, the Greek alphabet will emerge, influenced by Phoenician scripts, and the written tradition will revive in a new form and for new purposes. The gap in writing doesn't mean that people stopped thinking or organizing. It means our access to their daily decisions, their names, their official concerns becomes thinner. A historian can see the outline of change. The intimate voice fades. That loss of voice is why this period still feels like a shadowed corridor in the timeline. It also helps to remember that while some places show dramatic disruption, others show continuity or even new growth. The Phoenician cities, for example, would rise in prominence in the centuries that followed, becoming major maritime traders and cultural transmitters. New political formations appear in the Levant and inland regions. Over time, the Greek world reorganizes, and the seeds of the later city-state era take shape. So the collapse is not a single story of decline. It's also a story of recomposition. The map breaks and then redraws. And if you're listening from a modern vantage point, you can sense the human pattern repeating. A system becomes too tightly dependent on a certain balance. That balance fails, and new arrangements emerge, sometimes more local, sometimes more flexible, sometimes surprisingly innovative. There's another reason this era keeps pulling people back. It sits at the crossroads of myth and history. In Greece, the memory of a grand earlier age of heroes, palaces, and far-reaching kings may have filtered into later oral traditions. The Homeric epochs, composed centuries later, are not direct documentary history of the Bronze Age, but they may preserve cultural echoes of a world that felt larger and more aristocratic than what came afterward. That's a tricky point, and scholars argue about how to interpret it. But it adds an emotional layer to the period, the sense that even in antiquity, people were looking back at a past that already felt half lost. So in a way, the Bronze Age collapse produced not just material gaps, but a psychological one as well, a feeling of before and after that might have shaped identity for generations. If you put yourself gently into the time, not as a king, but as a farmer, a sailor, a craftsperson, you can imagine the lived experience of change. A trading ship doesn't arrive when it should. Grain prices rise. Rumors spread of raids along the coast. A local ruler demands new levies. A family decides to move inland or to a safer hilltop settlement. The large palatial centers that once felt permanent now feel uncertain. This is how big historical labels translate into daily life, a calendar of worry. And when you think about it that way, the collapse isn't just a puzzle for archaeologists. It's a reminder of how thin the line can be between an age that looks stable in hindsight and the fragile reality of people making choices without knowing what the next year will bring. By the time the dust settles, the Eastern Mediterranean is entering a new phase. The world of large, interconnected Bronze Age palace systems is replaced by a patchwork of smaller powers and restructured economies. Some skills and traditions carry forward, others narrow or vanish. Writing systems change. Trade networks are rebuilt on new terms. Over generations, the brightness returns, but it is a different kind of light. This is why the late Bronze Age collapse earns its place in a series about historical gaps. It shows how a sudden reduction in political and economic complexity can create a sense of missing time, not because life ended, but because the kinds of records we rely on became rarer. It also reminds us that collapse is not a single event with one villain. It's a process, one that can involve climate stress, conflict, migration, economic disruption, and internal instability all pushing at once. And it leaves behind a quiet lesson we'll keep coming back to. When the record goes thin, we should resist the urge to fill it with fantasy. The truth is already dramatic enough. A whole region's power structure wobbled, broke, and recomposed. Cities fell, others adapted, and across that boundary, human beings kept living, rebuilding the ordinary details of life while the grand arc of the age shifted above them. The fall of the Western Roman Empire and the reshaping of Europe. If the Bronze Age collapse feels like a sudden regional system failure, the end of Roman authority in the West feels more like a long, uneven power outage that happens neighborhood by neighborhood. People love a clean date for this story, and you'll often hear 476 CE, when the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. That date is useful as a signpost, but it's not the whole experience. For many communities, the Roman world had been changing for a long time before that, and in some places it kept on feeling Roman for generations afterward. So instead of treating this as a single night when the lights went out, it's better to think of it as a long transformation in which the political frame cracked, the economic map reoriented, and new identities gradually took shape inside the ruins of an old system. By the 3rd century, the empire was already dealing with repeated crises, civil wars, pressure on frontiers, inflation, and the stress of governing a vast territory with communication that moved at the speed of horses and ships. The reforms of emperors like Diocletian tried to stabilize the system by reorganizing administration and sharing power across regions. Later, Constantine's reign reshaped the empire again, with the growth of Christianity as a major imperial force and the shift of political gravity toward the Eastern Mediterranean. The empire did not split overnight into 2 separate worlds with no overlap, but over time, the East and West developed different priorities, different resource bases, and different degrees of resilience. The East had larger cities, stronger tax structures in many areas, and a geography that supported wealthier trade networks. The West, especially in its northern and western provinces, was more vulnerable to disruption and had fewer large urban centers that could anchor state power in the same way. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the story becomes more visibly dramatic. The Goths, pushed by complex forces that included pressure from the Huns, entered Roman territory and eventually fought Roman armies. The sack of Rome in 1010 by the Visigoths shocked the Roman imagination, not because it was the first time a city had been taken in war, but because Rome carried symbolic weight far beyond its strategic value at that moment. Later, the Vandals took North Africa, a crucial grain supplier, and their control of sea routes chipped away at the West's economic stability. Britain drifted out of imperial control, and over time, Roman structures there gave way to new political realities shaped by local elites and incoming groups. Meanwhile, in Italy, the political center of the Western Empire struggled to maintain coherence. The imperial court moved, armies were stretched thin, and loyalty was something that had to be negotiated constantly with commanders and federated groups who had their own interests. It's easy to imagine this as a story of barbarians at the gates, but that phrase can be misleading. Many of the groups who entered Roman territory did not see themselves as destroyers of civilization. They often wanted land, status, security, and a place inside a system that had long been part of their world. Some served as allies, some as rivals. Their leaders adopted Roman titles, Roman styles of rule, and sometimes even Roman law. If you zoom out a little, what you see is not just invasion, but integration, conflict, and reinvention happening at the same time. Rome's political umbrella in the West weakened, but Roman culture did not simply evaporate. Instead, it mixed with new power structures. After 476, kingdoms emerged that were unmistakably new, but not entirely un-Roman. The Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, and others ruled populations that included Roman elites, Roman bishops, Roman legal traditions, and Roman urban habits, even as military and political leadership followed new lines. In many places, the church became a key thread of continuity. Bishops were not just spiritual leaders, they were civic figures who negotiated with rulers, organized relief, and preserved education in some form. Monastic communities, too, played a role in keeping literacy and manuscript culture alive, though in a more localized and religiously focused way than the old imperial bureaucracy. This is part of why the term Dark Ages is tricky. The label can be shorthand for periods where our documentation is thinner and the old state infrastructure is gone, but it can also suggest an empty cultural landscape, which isn't accurate. What changes most clearly is the scale of institutions. The Roman state could maintain long road networks, professional armies, large cities with complex supply systems, and an economy that connected the Mediterranean in a relatively consistent way. When that framework fractured in the West, long-distance trade became more regional in many areas. Urban life in some places shrank. The tax systems that supported large public works became harder to sustain. That shift affects what archaeologists find: fewer monumental buildings, more local styles, less standardized material culture, and that can look, from far away, like a sudden global dimming. But again, on the ground, people adjusted. They did not wake up thinking, "We are now in the early Middle Ages." They were trying to keep farms productive, secure borders, manage local disputes, and find patronage under new rulers. The changes were real, but the experience of change was human scale. There is also a spatial element to this story that often gets missed in simplified summaries. The Roman world was not one uniform machine. The Mediterranean coast, with its shipping lanes, had different strengths and vulnerabilities than the inland frontiers. Some regions experienced sharper breaks, others experienced slow, partial continuities. A city in southern Gaul might keep older Roman habits longer than a rural zone far from major arteries of trade. Italy itself had uneven experiences depending on local politics and the shifting needs of new rulers. So the gap we associate with Rome's fall is not a single hole in time. It is a patchwork of thinner and thicker records across different regions. And while the West was reshaping itself, the Eastern Roman Empire did not disappear. It continued, increasingly centered in Constantinople, and later historians would call it the Byzantine Empire. That continuity matters because it shows that Rome was not a single brittle object that shattered everywhere at once. It was a set of institutions and identities that evolved differently in different places. The East maintained imperial bureaucracy and urban life at large scale for centuries longer, and its survival helped preserve and transmit legal, administrative, and theological traditions that would later shape medieval and modern Europe in their own ways. So what is the lost knowledge element here? It's not that people forgot how to build, speak, or think. It's that certain kinds of coordinated, state-supported expertise became harder to sustain in the West. Large-scale engineering that required steady tax revenue and centralized planning was less common. The education of professional administrators narrowed. The production and copying of secular texts likely decreased in many regions, as the economic base changed and the church became the main institutional home for literacy. But even there, it's not pure loss. It's a shift in emphasis. The kinds of texts that survive tend to be the kinds that mattered to the institutions that could afford to preserve them. That changes the shape of our window into the period. We see a world that looks more religious, more local, more fragmented, partly because that is what survived best, not necessarily because that is all that existed. All of this makes the Western Roman transition one of the most important examples of a historical gap that is also a historical bridge. The empire's Western political unity ended, yes, but something else began. A new Europe of kingdoms, new legal hybrids, new languages evolving into the forms we would later recognize as French, Spanish, Italian, and others. The social order reorganized. The idea of Roman legitimacy lingered like an afterimage, influencing rulers who wanted to present themselves as heirs rather than replacements. And over time, the memory of Rome became a powerful cultural resource, something later societies would revive, reinterpret, and argue over. So, if you're listening to this in the slow rhythm of a sleep story, take the gentle version of the lesson. The fall of the Western Empire is not a simple tale of civilization ending. It's a reminder that historical gaps often hide transformation more than they hide emptiness. The record gets thinner in certain places because institutions change, economies shift, and cultural priorities move. The map of power redraws itself, and the styles of memory change with it. Rome in the West did not vanish into a void. It dissolved into new forms of life that felt less imperial and more local, less uniform and more varied. And in that long transition, the timeline doesn't break so much as bend. The story continues, but in a different voice. The Indus Valley Civilization's Mysteries. If there's one ancient society that perfectly fits the theme of this series, it's the Indus Valley Civilization. Not because it's spooky or unknowable in a sensational way, but because it's so clearly real, so clearly sophisticated, and yet still quiet where we most want to hear a voice. This was one of the largest urban cultures of the ancient world, flourishing roughly between about 2600 and 1900 BCE, stretching across a huge area in what is now Pakistan and northwest India. It had major cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, and dozens, really hundreds, of smaller towns and villages connected by trade, shared standards, and a recognizable material culture. When archaeologists began to uncover these sites, one of the first surprises was how planned and consistent many of them were. Streets laid out in orderly grids, carefully built brick architecture, public and private wells, and especially the drainage systems, which still feel impressive when you think about what it takes to coordinate construction at that scale. You don't get that kind of urban order by accident. It suggests a society that valued civic organization and had the ability to make large projects happen across distance and time. You also see striking signs of standardization. Bricks often follow consistent ratios. Weights and measures appear remarkably uniform across the civilization's territory. Seals with animal motifs and short inscriptions show up in many places, suggesting shared systems of identity, trade, and maybe administration. And there's evidence of long-distance exchange. Mesopotamian sources appear to reference a distant trading partner, often associated with the Indus world, and Indus goods and styles show up beyond their core region. So we're not looking at a small, isolated culture. We're looking at a major player in the Bronze Age world. And yet, for all that clarity, the biggest mystery remains right at the center: the script. Thousands of inscriptions exist, mostly short, often on seals and small objects. But the writing system has not been convincingly deciphered. That fact alone shapes almost everything else we can say. Without readable texts, we don't have the names of kings, if kings existed in the way we imagine them. We don't have mythologies written in their own words. We don't have law codes, diplomatic letters, or a narrative of how they understood themselves. The cities speak, the artifacts speak, but the people's formal written voice is still out of reach. And that creates a very specific kind of historical gap. It's not the gap of a civilization that vanished without leaving a trace. The Indus world left a lot. It's the gap of a civilization that left the outline of a story, but not the dialogue. When you compare this to Egypt or Mesopotamia, the contrast is almost unfair. Those societies left long texts, royal inscriptions, temple records, literary works, legal documents. The Indus world left something different, a material language of infrastructure and consistent standards. That difference doesn't mean the Indus people were less complex. It just means our access is different. We see their priorities reflected in practical systems, water management, urban layout, craft production, trade. If you're listening to this calmly, slowly, it's easy to imagine daily life in those cities, the rhythm of markets, the sound of workshops, the texture of brick underfoot after a monsoon rain, the way predictable standards could make trade easier and disputes rarer. But then you bump into that wall of silence again. Who coordinated these standards? Was there a centralized state? A network of city councils? A religious authority? A shared commercial culture strong enough to align practices across hundreds of miles? Scholars debate these questions because the evidence can support more than one model. There are fewer clear signs of the kind of monumental royal art you see in Egypt, fewer obvious king lists, fewer huge self-glorifying inscriptions. That has led some researchers to imagine a political style that may have been less focused on individual rulers and more on collective or civic order. But we should be careful here. Absence of certain evidence isn't proof of absence in reality. It might reflect different cultural choices, or simply what has and hasn't survived. Another intriguing feature is religious and symbolic life. We see figurines, seals, and recurring motifs. Some of these elements have been linked, cautiously, to later South Asian religious traditions, but the line between cautious continuity and overconfident storytelling is thin. It's tempting to draw straight arrows across thousands of years. The safer approach is to note possible echoes without treating them as settled facts. The Indus world deserves to be understood on its own terms first, not only as a prelude to later histories. Then we arrive at the question of decline. What happened after about 1900 BCE, when the urban system seems to shift and, in many places, reduce in scale? The older, simpler story you might still hear in casual retellings points to invasion, but most modern scholarship has moved away from a single invasion narrative as the primary explanation for this transition. The evidence points more strongly toward a slower, multi-causal change shaped by environment, economy, and shifting settlement patterns. River systems likely changed course over time. The broader climate may have become less favorable for the kind of large, water-reliant urban concentration the mature Indus phase depended on. Monsoon patterns could have weakened. Agriculture may have adapted by shifting toward different crops and different regional strategies. In that kind of scenario, what looks like collapse might be better viewed as dispersal and reorganization. People didn't necessarily vanish. They may have moved to smaller settlements closer to more reliable water sources and adjusted their social and economic life to new conditions. That's a very human pattern, not a sudden ending, but a long recalibration. One detail that often gets overlooked in popular summaries is how wide the Indus world actually was. This wasn't just two famous cities. Sites like Dholavira show remarkable regional variation and innovation, including sophisticated water storage strategies. Lothal is often discussed in connection with maritime trade. There are countless smaller sites where the everyday fabric of life becomes visible: cooking spaces, craft debris, local religious practice, and the ordinary tools of survival. When you include those places in your mental map, the Indus story feels less like a single candle that went out and more like a constellation that changed shape. Some lights dim, others appear in new places. The pattern of settlement shifts, but the human presence continues. And this is why the Indus Valley fits so neatly into our theme. The mystery here is not a blank spot where nothing can be said. It's a richly textured civilization with one central missing key. If we could read the script, many questions might suddenly become simpler. We might learn how power was organized. We might understand what they called their cities. We might hear their origin stories, their laws, their jokes, their complaints, their prayers. But we can't, at least not yet. So we rely on what their infrastructure and artifacts tell us. And strangely, that creates a different kind of intimacy. We come to know them through how they built, how they measured, how they handled water, how they standardized trade. It's a reminder that civilization is not only about grand monuments or famous kings, it's also about quiet competence, the ability to live together in dense cities without constant collapse into chaos, the ability to agree on shared standards, the ability to plan for seasonal rhythms of water, heat, and labor. In a series about gaps, the Indus Valley is a good anchor point because it keeps us honest. It shows the limits of our narrative instincts. We don't get to lean on royal chronicles. We don't get to quote a national epic written by their own scribes. We have to infer carefully from the ground. And in doing so, we see something that is easy to miss in louder histories. A civilization that may have been less performative about power and more focused on systems that made daily life stable. That's not a romantic fantasy. It's simply one plausible reading of the evidence we do have. So, as we leave the streets of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro behind, the calm takeaway is simple. The Indus Valley civilization is not lost in the dramatic sense of being swallowed whole by time. It is partially hidden, in a very specific way. We can see what they built. We can see how widely they connected their world. We can see that they were among the great urban experiments of the Bronze Age. But their written voice remains quiet. And that quiet is exactly the kind of historical space we're exploring here. Not an empty gap, but a place where the story is real, the evidence is strong, and the most human details still hover just beyond our reach. When people hear the phrase "lost civilizations of the Americas," the mind often jumps straight to a dramatic image: jungles swallowing stone temples, empty plazas, silent pyramids. That image isn't totally wrong, but it's incomplete. Because the deeper, more accurate story is not just about disappearance, it's about change. About societies that rose to impressive scale, then reorganized, relocated, or transformed under pressures that were political, ecological, and deeply human. And it's also about the fact that many descendant communities never lost these histories at all. even when outside written records were thin or when later narratives tried to simplify what happened. So tonight, instead of chasing a single big mythical vanishing act, we're going to move through a few real places where the record shifts in a way that still raises questions, and we'll do it carefully, without treating complexity like a mystery box. Let's start with the Maya, because they're one of the best-known examples and also one of the most misunderstood. The classic story you may have heard is that the Maya collapsed, but the right question is, which Maya, where, and when? The Maya world was never one single empire with one capital. It was a landscape of city-states, alliances, rivalries, dynasties, and shifting power centers across a huge region. In the classic period, many southern lowland cities saw dramatic declines in population and monument building around the 8th and 9th century CE, and some sites were abandoned. That is a real and major change, but it wasn't a total end of Maya people or Maya culture. Northern centers continued to flourish in different forms, and Maya communities persisted across the centuries into the present. So the collapse is better understood as a regional political and demographic transformation, not a vanishing of a civilization into thin air. Why did it happen in some places? The evidence suggests a mix of stresses. Political competition became intense. Warfare increased in certain periods. Elite legitimacy might have fractured, and environmental pressure likely mattered too. Droughts in parts of the region would have placed serious strain on cities dependent on stable water and agricultural systems. In a tightly balanced urban and political ecology, even a few decades of climate stress can push conflict, migration, and internal instability into a cascade. That combination of human decisions and environmental limits is often what historical change looks like when you zoom in close. Then there's Teotihuacan in central Mexico, one of the largest cities in the ancient world at its height. It's hard to overstate how influential this place was. Its architecture, iconography, and trade networks reached far beyond the Valley of Mexico. And yet, at some point in the mid-first millennium CE, the city's power and population declined sharply. There are signs of internal unrest and destruction in elite sectors. The political order that had managed such a vast urban system seems to have fractured. Again, the temptation is to want one clean explanation. But large cities are complicated organisms. Internal conflict, shifting trade routes, class tensions, and environmental challenges can all interact. What matters for our theme is that after Teotihuacan's decline, the region didn't go empty. New centers of power rose, and later societies remembered Teotihuacan as a place of immense symbolic weight. Sometimes a city's greatest influence begins after its political peak, when it becomes a monument in the imagination of those who come next. Further north, in what is now the U.S. Southwest, the story takes a different but equally compelling shape. The communities associated with what we often call the ancestral Puebloans built remarkable settlements and ceremonial centers. Chaco Canyon, for example, is one of those sites that feels both precise and slightly hard to define in political terms. We can see planned great houses, road systems, distinctive architecture, and evidence of long-distance exchange. The region appears to have been a major cultural and ceremonial hub around the 11th and early 12th centuries. Then, over time, the population pattern shifts. People moved, settlement strategies changed, large-scale construction slowed. Droughts and resource pressures likely played a role. Social and religious transformations likely did too. The important point is that this wasn't a story of people disappearing. It was a story of people relocating and reorganizing their lives in ways that made sense within changing environmental and social conditions. Descendant Pueblo communities maintain deep cultural connections to these landscapes. That continuity matters because it changes how we interpret the word lost. Something can be archaeologically quieter without being culturally erased. Now let's drift to the Mississippi Valley, to Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis. This is one of the most striking examples of large-scale urbanism in pre-Columbian North America, north of Mesoamerica. At its height, Cahokia had massive earthen mounds, complex social structures, and a regional influence that radiated across the Mississippian world. It's a place that forces a reset of outdated assumptions about what was possible in North America before European contact. And like other large centers, Cahokia experienced major changes over time. By the 13th and 14th centuries, population and political patterns shifted. Factors may have included ecological stress, flooding patterns, resource demands around a dense urban center, internal social tensions, and changing trade and alliance networks. The story isn't a simple mystery disappearance. It's a reminder that large, complex communities face real structural challenges, especially when climate and resource balance changes. And again, the Mississippian world continued in many forms across the region, with cultural legacies that did not vanish just because one major center changed course. This brings us to a bigger point about how we should think about gaps in the Americas. The most dramatic break in the historical record of the Western Hemisphere is not actually a pre-Columbian collapse. It's the demographic catastrophe that followed European contact, driven by disease, violence, forced labor, and systemic disruption. That isn't the soothing part of the story, but it is essential context. It is also one reason why some earlier histories were misread or undercounted. When later observers encountered reduced populations or reorganized communities, they sometimes assumed those landscapes had always been sparse, or that earlier societies must have been smaller than they really were. Modern archaeology, indigenous scholarship, and interdisciplinary research have done a lot to correct that picture. So, when we talk about lost and transformed worlds, it's crucial to avoid implying a narrative in which the Americas were a quiet stage waiting for history to arrive. These were dynamic regions with sophisticated agriculture, astronomy, architecture, and political systems. The gaps are often in our documentation and in older interpretations, not in the reality of pre-Columbian life. There's also a practical reason why our window into these histories can feel uneven. Many American societies used writing in forms that either did not survive well or were later destroyed. In Mesoamerica, for example, complex writing systems existed, but a large number of codices were lost after conquest. That loss shapes what we can hear today. The archaeology gives us city plans, monuments, agricultural systems, trade evidence, and, in some cases, inscriptions. But the everyday voices, the local debates, the smaller stories of how people experienced change can still feel distant. That distance is not proof of absence, it's a reminder of how fragile cultural archives can be. So, what should we take from these examples as we move through our bigger theme? First, that Collapse in the Americas often means regional political shifts, re-centered populations, and changes in alliance systems, not total cultural extinction. Second, that climate and environment matter, but they don't act alone. Drought doesn't automatically erase a society. It pressures decisions. It alters political legitimacy. It sharpens competition. It can make cities vulnerable if governance fails to adapt. Third, that modern narratives have sometimes framed these histories in ways that unintentionally dismiss continuity. It's worth saying plainly, the histories of the Americas before European contact are not just a series of ruins. They are living lineages connected to living peoples. That doesn't change the reality of ancient shifts and declines in certain regions. It just changes the tone with which we talk about them. The word lost can be useful as a poetic hook, but the more accurate word is often transformed. If you're listening to this slowly, letting the details settle into the background as sleep approaches, the calm version of the lesson is simple. These societies were not static. They were not fragile curiosities. They were complex human worlds dealing with the same kinds of pressures we've seen elsewhere: political competition, resource management, climate variability, and the challenge of sustaining large populations over long periods. When the record grows quieter at some sites, it doesn't mean the human story ended. It means the story moved. It changed location, scale, and form. The lights shifted across the map. And our job as careful listeners to the past is to notice that movement without turning it into a single dramatic myth, because the real history is already rich enough. When people talk about lost African civilizations, the word lost can be misleading in two different ways. Sometimes it makes it sound like these societies were swallowed by mystery, and sometimes it quietly suggests they were somehow less visible because they were less complex. Neither idea holds up. The better truth is simpler and more human. Many African histories were underrecorded in older global surveys, undertaught in schools outside the continent, and sometimes misunderstood through colonial-era assumptions. But the civilizations themselves were real, sophisticated, and deeply connected to the wider world. The gap we're often dealing with here is a gap in mainstream attention, not a gap in achievement. And that's an important reset for this series, because missing in a popular timeline is not the same as missing in reality. One gentle way to enter this chapter is to follow the trade routes, because trade tends to reveal what politics and ruins sometimes hide. Across the Sahara, for centuries, caravans carried salt, gold, textiles, and ideas. Along these routes, cities grew into centers of scholarship and state power. The Mali Empire is a good example of how visible African history becomes once we stop looking for the wrong kinds of evidence. Mali was not a small, isolated kingdom. It was a major power in West Africa with deep involvement in trans-Saharan networks. Its rulers managed resources and maintained influence across a large region. And its cultural footprint wasn't only economic. The city of Timbuktu, often reduced in pop culture to a punchline, meaning far away, was in reality a major intellectual center over long periods, with scholars, libraries, and traditions of Islamic learning that connected West Africa to the wider scholarly world of North Africa and the Middle East. This doesn't need exaggeration to be impressive. It just needs to be placed in the same mental category as other medieval centers of knowledge. The story here is not that the history is unknowable. The story is that outside narratives didn't always make room for it. Then there's Great Zimbabwe, which offers a different kind of clarity. The stone architecture is the kind of evidence that refuses to be ignored once you've seen it. Massive walls, carefully built without mortar, and a city that served as the heart of a powerful state between roughly the 11th and 15th centuries. Its prosperity was tied to trade networks that reached the Indian Ocean, linking inland resources to coastal exchange systems. For a long time, some outside commentators tried to explain Great Zimbabwe away with fantasies that denied African authorship. That's an uncomfortable part of the history of history. But the modern archaeological consensus is clear that Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people. Once you accept that simple fact, the site becomes what it should have always been in global storytelling, a major African urban and political achievement, shaped by regional power and global trade, not by imported myth. If you move northeast, the Kingdom of Aksum provides yet another angle on African complexity. Aksum was a major power in the Horn of Africa, flourishing roughly in the first millennium CE. Known for its monumental stelae, its coinage, and its strategic role in Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade. It engaged in diplomacy and conflict with neighboring powers and became one of the early states to adopt Christianity. In a different historical universe, Aksum would be as routinely named in broad world history overviews as Rome's neighbors or the Persian empires. It belongs in that conversation because it was one of the large organizing centers of its region, with an identity that was both local and cosmopolitan. West Africa also offers the later brilliance of the Songhai Empire and the earlier sophistication of Ghana, each with political structures and economic strategies tied to geography and long-distance exchange. What's striking is how often these histories were flattened into a single story about gold. Gold mattered, yes, but the presence of gold is never the whole story. Empires require systems, governance, taxation or tribute, military organization, diplomacy, and the cultural authority that persuades people that rule is legitimate. Those systems existed. They were adapted to local realities. They were not copies of European models. They were solutions to African landscapes, climates, and networks. And that distinction is part of what makes them interesting. Across the forest and coastal regions, you also find powerful city-states and kingdoms like Benin, known for its extraordinary artistic traditions and complex political organization. The art alone is enough to challenge outdated assumptions because it represents not just aesthetic skill, but institutional support, specialized guilds, and a culture confident in its own symbols of authority. In the broadest sense, these places remind us that African history contains multiple urban traditions, not one. The continent is too large and too diverse for a single template. You have Sahelian empires anchored in long-distance trade and scholar networks. You have coastal and forest polities with different economic ecosystems. You have highland and river-based systems with their own rhythms of agriculture and power. The gap, if we want to call it that, is often in the way older global narratives tried to compress this diversity into a small number of stereotypes. Another factor that shapes perceived silence is the uneven survival of written sources. Some regions maintained strong manuscript traditions. Others preserved memory through oral history, praise poetry, genealogies, and ritual authority. Those oral systems can be historically meaningful and detailed, but they don't always translate neatly into the kinds of archives that older Western academic traditions were trained to privilege. That mismatch created blind spots. Today, modern scholarship blends archaeology, linguistics, oral tradition, and written sources where they exist, building fuller pictures than the earlier simplistic maps. The result is a story that feels less like a rescue mission and more like a rebalancing of attention. Because much of this history was never truly lost. It was present in communities, landscapes, and living memory, even when global textbooks didn't pause long enough to notice. So if you're listening in the slow rhythm of a sleep story, you can let this chapter settle as a calm correction rather than a dramatic revelation. Africa's past does not need a mythic framing to be compelling. Its empires, cities, and cultural systems were shaped by real political choices, real environmental constraints, and real connections to wider worlds. The stones of Great Zimbabwe, the scholarly legacies of Mali and Songhai, the international reach of Axum, and the artistic power of Benin are not footnotes. They are central examples of how human societies build complexity in many different forms. And in a series about gaps, this chapter offers a slightly different comfort. Sometimes the missing space isn't in the past itself. Sometimes it's in the stories we were used to hearing. The Pacific is the kind of place that can make history feel small. It's not just big. It's so big that for a long time, many outsiders assumed the islands scattered across it must have been settled by accident, by people blown off course who survived by luck. That idea sounds tidy, and it flatters the modern habit of thinking that true navigation requires compasses, maps, and instruments. But the evidence points in a different direction. The settlement of the Pacific looks less like a string of accidents and more like one of the most disciplined achievements of exploration in human history, built on training, memory, and careful reading of the natural world. In a series about gaps, this chapter is here for a slightly refreshing reason. This is not a story where the past is missing because people failed to do something grand. It's a story where the past was grand, and the gap has often been in how long the rest of the world took to fully respect it. The broad outline is clear. The ancestors of Polynesian, Micronesian, and parts of Melanesian peoples were part of the wider Austronesian expansion, a long movement of seafaring communities that began thousands of years ago. Over time, their descendants carried languages, crops, technologies, and cultural systems across enormous ocean distances. The Lapita cultural horizon, associated with early settlement in parts of the western Pacific, is one visible archaeological marker of this outward movement, showing shared pottery styles and a pattern of coastal and island life that would later lead into the wider Polynesian world. From there, the story keeps widening. The settlement of remote Oceania, including places like Hawaii, Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, happened in the late 1st and early 2nd millennium CE, in a sequence that still gets refined as dating methods improve. Regardless of the exact micro-timelines, the scale is the point. These weren't short hops across a familiar coastline. These were planned voyages into open ocean where land could be hundreds or thousands of miles away. You don't do that repeatedly across generations without a real system for knowing where you are and where you're going. So, what did that system look like? It's often called wayfinding, and the word is useful because it doesn't reduce the practice to a single trick. It was a toolkit, and like all serious toolkits, it required training and repetition. Navigators learned star paths, not just individual stars, but the way certain stars rise and set in patterns that can be used like a moving compass. They learned the behavior of ocean swells, which can maintain consistent directions even when winds change. They paid attention to wind patterns, cloud formations, and bird flight. Some birds fly out to sea at dawn and return to land at dusk. Seeing them at the right time and angle can offer clues about the direction of land. Clouds can gather differently above islands due to changes in humidity and airflow. The color of the sea, the drift of vegetation, even the feel of the canoe in water with a certain underlying swell could become part of a trained reading of space. This wasn't superstition, it was expertise. It's easy to romanticize this and make it sound purely intuitive, as if a gifted navigator simply felt the ocean and arrived. But the more respectful view is that this was a structured knowledge tradition. It had rules, teaching lineages, and standards of mastery. Like any high-level skill, it could look effortless from the outside only because of how much disciplined practice sat underneath. The canoes themselves mattered too. Successful long-distance voyaging required advanced boat-building knowledge. Double-hulled canoes and outrigger systems provided stability and cargo capacity, allowing the transport of people, tools, plants, and animals. The settlement of new islands wasn't just a daring weekend trip. It was often a planned transfer of a living system. Taro, yams, breadfruit where applicable, domesticated animals, and the cultural knowledge necessary to establish new communities. That detail alone pushes against the accident narrative. Accidents don't bring an entire portable ecology with them in a repeatable pattern. Intent does. There's also a social side that gets overlooked when we focus only on navigation technique. Exploration requires a reason. Sometimes the reason is population pressure. Sometimes it's political conflict. Sometimes it's ambition, trade, or the cultural prestige of being the founder of a new lineage. The oral traditions of many Pacific cultures preserve memories of voyaging ancestors and named canoes. These traditions are not simple literal logbooks, but they can encode real patterns of movement and identity. They also remind us that the ocean was not a void. It was a highway, a shared space where communities interacted, exchanged goods, and developed relationships over distance. When European explorers arrived much later, they encountered societies that already had long histories of inter-island travel, knowledge of sea routes, and cultural maps of the Pacific that had nothing to do with Western cartography. This is where the lost element intersects with our theme. The knowledge wasn't lost to the people who held it, but the outside world often didn't know how to categorize it. Because this knowledge lived in memory, performance, and apprenticeship, it didn't always leave a heavy paper trail that older global histories were trained to prioritize. And because colonial-era narratives often underestimated indigenous technology, the sophistication of Pacific navigation was sometimes treated as an anomaly rather than a system. In that sense, the gap here has been as much about interpretation as about evidence. Modern revivals of traditional voyaging have helped make this point tangible. When you see a canoe navigate long distances using reconstructed or preserved wayfinding methods, it becomes harder to maintain the old dismissive assumptions. But even without modern demonstrations, the settlement pattern across the Pacific already implies the existence of robust navigation. The distances are too large and the success too consistent to reduce it to wind-blown luck. Another subtle layer to this story is how environmental knowledge and cultural knowledge blend. Navigators didn't only read the sky and sea. They also understood seasonal windows, when winds and currents were more favorable. They understood risk. This wasn't reckless adventure for its own sake. It was a calculated engagement with an environment that rewards patience and punishes arrogance. If you're listening to this as a sleep story, you might let that idea settle in a calming way. The Pacific tradition of navigation is a reminder that human intelligence is not one shape. It doesn't always announce itself through metal instruments or written manuals. Sometimes it lives in a practiced relationship with nature that is as rigorous as any classroom discipline. There is also the question of contact beyond the Pacific itself. You may have heard the idea that Polynesians might have had some form of contact with South America before European arrival. The presence of the sweet potato in Polynesia before sustained European contact is often discussed as evidence of some kind of pre-contact exchange across the Eastern Pacific, though the details of how, when, and how often remain debated. This is a good place to model our overall approach. We don't need to turn a plausible exchange into a sweeping story of large-scale colonization. The careful version is already interesting. Long-distance voyagers may have connected worlds that later histories treated as separate. Even a limited episode of contact would be a remarkable extension of what we already know these navigators could do. And whether the strongest future conclusions land on direct voyaging, multi-step exchange, or some combination of routes, the more important point for our theme is that the Pacific was never an empty middle of nowhere. It was a peopled, mapped, and mastered space in the minds of those who traveled it. If you step back and look at the wider arc, the settlement of the Pacific is a story with a very different emotional texture than the collapses we've already covered. The Bronze Age world shows us how interconnected systems can falter under layered stress. The Roman transition shows us how institutions can thin while cultures reshape themselves. The Indus Valley shows us what it feels like to stand near a civilization whose written voice remains just out of reach. But the Pacific story tells us something else. Sometimes the gap is in our assumptions. We expected to find mastery in one form, and because it came in another, we failed to recognize it at first. That's a useful warning for the whole project of history. The lens we use can be as limiting as the evidence we possess. So the calm takeaway here is simple. Across the Pacific, generations of navigators created a knowledge tradition precise enough to guide deliberate settlement across enormous distances. They carried living systems with them. They built societies adapted to island ecologies, from high volcanic landscapes to low coral atolls. They developed political and religious cultures that made sense of ocean life and the responsibilities of expansion. None of this requires exaggeration. The scale is already extraordinary. And in a series about unexplained gaps, this chapter is a reminder that some missing histories were never missing at all. They were simply waiting for the world to learn how to listen to a different kind of archive, one carried in stars, swells, memory, and the quiet competence of people who understood that the ocean is not an obstacle when you've learned to read it as a map. This chapter takes us farther back than the others, into a time where the evidence is different and the scale of the story is huge. We're leaving written records behind completely. We're relying on ice cores, lake sediments, pollen, changes in animal populations, and the quiet clues left by early human communities. And the reason to go this far back is simple. If you want to understand why human history has gaps and sudden turns, you eventually have to face the fact that climate can change the rules faster than societies can comfortably adapt. The Younger Dryas is one of the sharpest reminders of that. In broad terms, the Younger Dryas was a sudden return to colder conditions near the end of the last ice age, starting around 12,900 years ago and ending around 11,700 years ago. The exact mechanics are still debated in detail, but the basic story many researchers work with is that a major disruption to North Atlantic circulation, possibly driven by large pulses of meltwater, weakened the heat transport system that had been helping the Northern Hemisphere warm. And when that system shifted, the climate over parts of the world shifted with it. The temperature didn't slide slowly for centuries in a gentle curve. It appears to have changed relatively quickly on a geological timescale, which means that for people living through it, the world could have felt like it was turning unpredictable within lifetimes, not merely over mythical eras. Now, it's important to keep our footing here. This doesn't mean every region cooled in exactly the same way or at the same intensity. Climate is not a single global thermostat. It's a set of regional patterns. But the Younger Dryas stands out as a major event because it seems to have interrupted a warming trend and imposed new stress on ecosystems across parts of the Northern Hemisphere. If you imagine human groups who were already adjusting to changing conditions as the Ice Age ended, you can see how a sudden climatic reversal could complicate everything. The distribution of plants changes, herd routes change, water availability shifts, the reliability of certain food sources becomes less predictable. And for small, mobile, or semi-sedentary communities, that kind of disruption can make the difference between stability and hard choices. This is where the Younger Dryas often gets pulled into a bigger conversation about the origins of agriculture. Some researchers have suggested that in the Near East, climate stress during this cold snap may have pressured communities that were already experimenting with intensified plant use to push further toward cultivation. The idea isn't that climate caused agriculture in a simple one-step way. It's that climate may have made certain strategies more attractive or even more necessary in some places. If wild grains became less reliable across a region, investing in the management and eventual domestication of plants could shift from a clever option to a survival strategy. This is still a careful hypothesis rather than a single settled storyline, but it helps explain why the Younger Dryas shows up so often in discussions of early sedentism and the deep roots of farming. When you zoom in on the Natufian culture in the Levant, for example, you see communities that were already living in more settled patterns before full agriculture took hold. The Younger Dryas may have made that way of life harder in some areas, pushing shifts in mobility, diet, and eventually plant management. Again, the key word is may. The evidence suggests stress and transition, not a simple thermometer to plow equation. Human beings don't respond to climate like robots. They respond through culture, politics, local ecology, and the options their landscapes give them. But the timing is provocative enough that historians and archaeologists keep revisiting it with fresh data. There's also a wider lesson here for our theme of historical gaps. In later eras, we can watch bureaucracies fail, trade networks fracture, and writing traditions thin out. In deep prehistory, we see something more basic, the background environment itself shifting. And when the background shifts, the human archive shifts too. Settlement patterns can break, sites can be abandoned, people can move into new regions or recompact around better resources. In the archaeological record, that can look like discontinuity. Not because civilization collapsed in the later sense, but because the conditions that supported certain lifeways changed faster than the old patterns could be maintained. In that sense, the Younger Dryas is a reminder that some of the oldest gaps in human history are not political at all. They're ecological. It's also worth addressing, calmly and briefly, the more sensational ideas that circulate around this period. You might have heard claims of a major cosmic impact at the onset of the Younger Dryas, sometimes described as a comet or asteroid event that triggered widespread fires and sudden cooling. This is a contested hypothesis. Some researchers have argued for it. Many others remain unconvinced and point to alternative explanations or issues with the evidence. For our purposes, we don't need that debate to do heavy lifting. The Younger Dryas is significant even under the more widely accepted models that focus on ocean and climate system changes. So we can note the controversy exists without building the chapter on it. The grounded story is already dramatic enough. If we widen the view beyond the Near East, the Younger Dryas may have influenced human trajectories in different ways in different regions. In parts of Europe, it likely altered the availability of key resources for hunter-gatherers who were tracking game and seasonal plant cycles. In North America, communities living at the end of the Pleistocene were already navigating changes in megafauna and shifting habitats. The Younger Dryas sits near the broader period of ecological reorganization that includes major changes in large animal populations. It's hard to connect every thread cleanly, but the overlap in timing reminds us that climate change and ecosystem transition can set the stage for cultural reorientation, even if we can't always map cause and effect with perfect certainty. That nuance is important in a series like this. The temptation, especially in popular storytelling, is to turn the Younger Dryas into a single master key that explains everything that follows. But history rarely gives us one key. It gives us a ring of keys, and you have to test them gently. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that this was a period of abrupt climate stress in the transition out of the last ice age, and that human communities living then adapted in varied, region-specific ways. Some likely became more mobile. Some intensified certain food strategies. Some may have experimented with cultivating plants in more deliberate ways. And over time, as the climate warmed again after the Younger Dryas ended, the conditions for more widespread agriculture and larger, more stable settlements improved. The larger emotional resonance of this chapter is that it turns our series inside out. We started with historical gaps that feel like missing chapters in the story of states and cities. Here, we're in a world before states and before writing, when the chapters are written in landscape and behavior. The gap is not an empty space where nothing happened. It's a shift in how people had to live. And because those lives were recorded mostly in the small and sturdy artifacts of daily survival, We're reading a quieter kind of human story. A story of adjustments made by small groups who didn't know they were living through an event that future scientists would name. This is, in a way, the most human version of uncertainty. You go out to hunt or gather as you always have, and the patterns are changing. The winter feels longer. The usual plants are scarcer. The herds come through later, or not at all. You move camp. You change your tools. You change what you store, what you share, what you risk. And those choices, repeated across years and generations, are what eventually transform the long arc of human history. So, if you're listening in that slow, late-night rhythm, let the Younger Dryas sit as a quiet anchor for everything else we've discussed. It reminds us that the fragility of continuity is not only political, it's environmental. A civilization can lose its script when palaces fall, but a pre-civilized community can lose a stable way of life when the climate shifts. The mechanisms are different, but the feeling of the record thinning out can be surprisingly similar. And that's the final reason this chapter belongs here. It gives us a deep time perspective on the same theme. Human history has gaps because the world itself changes, and because our traces of adaptation are always partial. The story doesn't stop, it just moves into a different shape, one that we can still glimpse if we listen carefully to the earth, the ice, and the quiet choices of people who were already, even then, inventing the next way to live. As we come to the end of this journey, I want to gently pull the camera back one last time. We started with the idea that history has gaps, and we tried to treat that as something real and understandable, not something that automatically calls for dramatic or exotic explanations. Over the course of these chapters, we watched a few different kinds of silence take shape. In the Late Bronze Age, we saw how an interconnected world can stumble when multiple pressures hit close together, and how the collapse of institutions can thin out the written record, even when life continues. In the Western Roman story, we saw a long transformation that reshaped Europe without neatly erasing everything Roman, and we saw how the scale of administration and trade can change what survives for us to study. In the Indus Valley, we saw a different kind of quiet entirely. Cities that speak clearly through design and standardization, paired with a script that keeps the inner voice of the civilization just outside our grasp. In the Americas, we reminded ourselves that lost often really means reorganized, relocated, or transformed, and that cultural continuity doesn't always look like continuity in the ruins. In Africa, we confronted a version of the gap that's partly about storytelling itself, about what older global narratives chose to spotlight and what they left in the margins. In the Pacific, we saw something almost uplifting for this kind of series, a reminder that sometimes the gap isn't in past achievement, but in how long it took outsiders to recognize a different kind of expertise. And with the Younger Dryas, we stepped into deep time and saw how environmental shifts can create the earliest versions of discontinuity, long before writing or empires, forcing human communities into new shapes of survival and creativity. If there's a single thread that ties these together, it's this: a historical gap is not the same thing as a human void. The record is what survived, not everything that happened. And what survives is shaped by materials, climate, power, accident, and the priorities of institutions. A clay tablet may outlive 1,000 spoken stories. A stone wall may remain, while a whole language fades from the local landscape. And sometimes the most meaningful parts of a civilization's experience are exactly the parts least likely to be preserved in the forms we can recognize quickly. That can feel frustrating, especially if you like clean timelines. But it can also be strangely calming, because it means we don't have to force the past into a perfect story to respect it. The past was lived by real people, who rarely got the luxury of knowing which parts of their world would survive in museum cases and academic arguments. Most of them didn't think they were standing at the edge of an era. They were just trying to make the next season work. Another thing worth holding on to is that gaps are not static. They shrink and change as new discoveries appear. A site is found. A dating method improves. A forgotten manuscript tradition is cataloged. A new collaboration between archaeology and oral history opens a different door. So part of the honest mood of this series is accepting uncertainty without turning it into despair. We don't know everything. We probably never will. But we know more than we used to, and we will likely know more tomorrow than we do today. That slow expansion of understanding is one of the quiet pleasures of history, when you approach it with patience. You can also take a more personal comfort from all of this. The rise and fall rhythm we've been discussing isn't only about grand civilizations. It's also a reminder of how memory works in ordinary life. Families forget details over generations. Cities remodel themselves until the old neighborhoods are hard to recognize. Languages change. Traditions shift. What we keep is not always what we intended to keep. That doesn't make the present meaningless. It just makes it part of a larger human pattern. We build, we adapt, we sometimes lose pieces of ourselves, and we carry forward what we can. And we do it again. The gaps don't have to feel like holes that ruin the story. They can feel like space. Space for careful curiosity. Space for future discovery. Space for humility about what evidence can and can't do. The Bronze Age didn't vanish into myth. Rome didn't fall into a simple darkness. The Indus people didn't disappear just because their script remains unread. The Americas and Africa don't need the word lost to carry their weight in the human story. And the Pacific is proof that extraordinary knowledge can live outside the formats that older histories were trained to prioritize. In other words, the timeline doesn't break because humanity is fragile in spirit. It breaks because the world is complex, and because the archive we inherit is always incomplete. And that's okay. That incompleteness is part of what keeps history alive as a discipline and as a way of thinking. It keeps us honest, it keeps us curious, it keeps us aware that the past is larger than any single narrative we can fit into a video, a textbook, or a lifetime of reading. So as we close the last page of this episode, let the mysteries stay soft around the edges. Let the known facts do the heavy lifting. Let the unanswered questions exist without pressure. Thank you so much for watching our video and supporting the channel. See you in the next episodes, and good night.